Well, let's start with the launch of the new political advocacy group Muslim Votes Matter in Melbourne today. Here was the national spokesman for the group speaking to Sky earlier.
We are not a political party and we have no intention of ever becoming a political party. The real issue we have as a community in this country is for too long our community has been taken for granted by both sides of politics and our voice isn't being heard and it's been silenced. Our aim really is to really tackle that issue and fundamentally elevate the voice of the Muslim community.
Now, the group's planning to target 12 Victorian seats at the next federal election, all of them held by Labor, and it'll hand out how-to-vote cards on election day. Now, they say the trigger for all of this is that Labor has taken advantage of Muslim voters in safe Labor seats, and of course they're not happy with the government's response to the conflict between Israel and Gaza, even though Australia has backed a ceasefire. Do you think this will actually turn the dial in any way, Hollie? I mean, if you look at the UK, and this is the example that's been used a number of times. Well, the Muslims had success in the UK, yes, but the UK has a first-past-the-post system. Yeah. So if you get 35% of people to vote for one person, well, you can get your candidate up. So you've got two options. Either it all falls over and the preferences eventually flow back to Labor anyway and it's status quo, or they get the Greens over the line. And the Greens don't necessarily share the same social policy that these Muslim voters do.
No, well, I think the hypocrisy if they're running this campaign because they're not happy with Labor's approach on the Gaza situation, they would be even... I mean, the Greens may be appealing to them from that perspective, but when we start to look at other social issues, as you say, I'm not quite sure the Queers for Palestine would be granted a great big welcome parade, even heading into some of these safe Labor seats. My concerns are that we end up with a parliament that is really just a rabble, that's almost so dysfunctional in a minority government of just all these competing interests. But ultimately, I don't think it's going to come to anything because, as you say, I think the preferences are just going to flow back Labor's way because you're not going to find that they'll be able to go green after the social issues start to impact. What's the drugs for all?
Yeah, exactly. What's the feeling in the Labor Party, Joe?
Yeah, I think in Sydney and southwest Sydney, I think they feel fairly comfortable. I mean, these are working class communities that are going to be voting on economic issues and bread and butter issues and who is best placed to reduce the cost of living. My feeling is that it's some of those inner city seats in Melbourne which actually don't necessarily have such a high Muslim population but have a very high upper middle class socialist population who are all in on Gaza. So somewhere like Wills, for example, a Jed Carney seat as well. I forget, it used to be Batman, it's now called something else, I think. They could be vulnerable because they have a really high Green vote, and if you peeled over a couple of percent off Labor and gave it to the Greens, plus picked up maybe a few people who might be voting for various disparate independents here and there, you could actually sort of do a teal a bit and leapfrog over Labor in a 2PP situation. So so maybe a couple of seats in Melbourne. I don't think so. And again, I find it quite ugly and in a way racist or Islamophobic perhaps, that there's this assumption that all Muslims vote the same way or have the same interests. And again, most of the Muslims or people I speak to in southwest Sydney, or other people I speak to in southwest Sydney who talk to people in those communities, say that the number one issue there is cost of living. It's bread and butter issues. They're not, they might have a position on Palestine, but that's not the issue that is going to define their vote. And I was speaking to someone who lives in southwest Sydney just yesterday at a lunch, and he was saying that was very much the vibe he's getting. And again, Muslims are also a very diverse and complex and disparate group of people. Like, is a Sunni Muslim going to vote for a Shiite candidate? I would doubt it, given that they've spent the best part of the last few decades or centuries being at war with each other. So, again, it's like saying, all Irish people will vote the same way. Yes. An Irish Catholic's going to vote for an Orangeman? No effing way.
And it's to draw something of a comparison, Caroline. The last time we saw an example of that was The Voice, of course. And not every Aboriginal person supported The Voice either. And the idea that you would have something that represented all Aboriginal people in their thoughts was absolute nonsense. Now, they can purport this Muslim Votes Matter group, and there's another one in Sydney that is apparently thinking about running candidates of its own. Muslim Votes Matter has said they won't do that. They'll just be an advocacy group. But to think that you could actually represent all Muslim people, I think, as Joe says, is a bit insulting.
Well, I think there is an element of the bigotry of low expectations there, which Joe is describing, and we've seen well and truly play out when it comes to issues like The Voice and speaking on behalf of Indigenous communities. I do, however, think that the issue of Palestine is really important to a lot of Muslim people. We've had our own reporters go out to areas in Sydney, southwestern Sydney, and speak to people, and they've said on the street that this is something that would impact their vote. Now, whether it actually leads them to change their vote is another thing. What concerns me, not just as a member of the Jewish community, but as someone who cares about democracy in Australia, about peace, about maintaining Western values, is that the impact it will have on Labor's policies, how it will cause them to lean even more heavily into this pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel position that they currently have. And we're already seeing the first Palestinian Australian candidate being touted for a Melbourne seat at the moment, the Melbourne seat of Caldwell. Correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong.
No, Caldwell, correct. Former Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's
don't know if you ever made it to the Lodge.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. It's been a long time on the opposition bench.
You're correct, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, they've got this guy, Bassem Abdo. He's widely tipped to be pre-selected there. I think to appease, the 24% Muslim population in that seat. We're going to see more and more Labor trying to stave off any accusations that they're not there for their Muslim voters by increasingly looking at not just candidates like this, but policies which will cater to them as well. I think that's a concern.